Darrin, you're going to talk to us today about navigating medical standards.
And I do have some visuals here. I don't see the share screen button, Joe. I don't know if it's
Click on
possible
the
to.
bottom, hover by the bottom,
Mhm.
and it should be green. It's the one green.
Oh, there it is. I don't know why I didn't see it two moments ago.
Yeah, if you don't hover over it, it stays in.
Now you went and you hit a different button that made your wood paneling go away.
I know. So I'm using the virtual camera option in Zoom today. So we'll see how this pans out for everyone.
That's weird. I don't know
Bear
what
with
that
me
is,
one.
but
We'll see. I'll look like an old school newscaster here, hopefully in a few moments if all goes according to plan.
You got a typewriter going in the background?
Okay, so if that worked, it should say test right around here. Does that sound about right?
Not yet.
Darrin is okay.
There
Now
it
I
is.
see test.
There it is.
Yeah, tested. You're very, very fuzzy.
Oh, that's okay. You're not missing a whole lot. Sorry. One moment here.
It's the first time I've seen a triple screen. You're on my left, test is in the middle, and the gallery of people are on the right.
Same here.
Interesting.
Now he's frozen. I don't know.
Frozen.
And now not right. Let's just go
I'm
with
back.
hit the share.
I'm here.
Hit the share
We'll
button.
give it one more chance like this. If it doesn't work, we'll do it live and try it differently.
Why don't we take this?
All right.
Go ahead.
All right. Yeah, so wanted to talk about navigating medical device standards today. And I know the subtitle is A Guide for the Confused. So I do have an intro, but I wanted to issue a bit of a disclaimer first before really diving into it. You're still going to be confused, I think, at the end of our talk here. I think standards are just one of those inherently confusing.
Darrin, I need to stop you. You're freezing and this setup is not working.
Oh, we lost them.
I do know there's been several outages I just got from my IT guys that literally major companies have been impacted by it.
Oh yeah, CrowdStrike. I wonder if every news article I've seen about it has to do with grounding airplanes. Maybe we've grounded Darrin.
Yeah, no, I don't think the virtual camera is working. I'm just going to share the screen itself, and then I'll spare you having to look at me. So one moment.
I'm
it
going
took
to
down EMIS Web in the UK as well, Joe. So there's been quite a few folks struggling to make appointments with their GPs today.
Oh. There we go.
Right.
There it is.
Maybe instead now should be looking at a big photo of Edward R. Murrow.
Yeah. For the sake of the video that will be in the archive, why don't we forget all that? And I'll say, Darrin, you're going to talk to us today about navigating medical standards, a guide for the confused.
Thank you, Joe. And yeah.
And he's gone. I think we may just have a.
All right, I'm sorry. This is still not working, no matter how hard I try here.
Yeah, if you're trying to overlay yourself on top of the visual, don't even bother. We can still see your face on the individual little screens.
Are you going to be showing screens of like CPT codes and the like, in which case visuals will be very helpful? If so, you can send me the presentation and I can run it for you.
Okay. Sure. Bear with me one moment. I can email it to you. It's a little, you'll see my presentation style is a bit unorthodox here, but I will.
Okay. It's coming to me as a PowerPoint?
Yes.
Okay. In the meanwhile, Richard Bunny, why don't you entertain us with what you've done professionally this last month?
I like the way you set boundaries around that, Joe. What I've been doing this last month, we've been trying to develop a couple of AI agents that will allow you to search through a collection of device regulations and answer your medical device questions. So we've been trying to pilot that, and we're making some progress on that. We've had to stick agents on top of agents just to try and make sure you get some reliable information out of that. And then The other main thing I've been doing this month is I've been helping an organization that's produces a risk prediction score for what's your likelihood of post-surgical complications if you come in for knee surgery. They run a neural algorithm based on your patient information, some of your hematology, to predict whether you need an intensive kind of environment for support after surgery or a low intensive environment. And we've helped them get registered as a UK Class 1 medical device. They're just about to launch a trial in a couple of hospitals in Wales, which will hopefully reduce the waiting list.
I'm intrigued. When you say we, are you speaking the royal we, or do you have a team?
I have a very small team. So
It's
in the
really
last 6
easy.
months, I set up a company called Deviceology about 6 months ago with a business partner in Brazil. So we've decided to fly solo. And our aspiration is to get to employee number 1 as quickly as possible. But our team at the moment includes the 2 of us. And then a series of business partners who do
Oh, we're
stuff.
trying the split screen thing again. Darrin?
Yes, last try here. I did send the slides over, but we can give it one last try here, and I'm still crashing Zoom.
Yes, you are. Did you send it to me at medicaldevicesgroup.net or medical device events? Because I'm refreshing it, nothing yet. Looks like a very big file at a minimum. Oh, okay. Darrin, we're not going to try that again.
Medicalmarcom.com
Oh, okay.
email, what I have.
That's fine. I'll look there.
Yeah. But out of work, Joe, whilst we've got 30 seconds, as I think I mentioned to you, I jumped on a plane over to Boston, cycled up to Brunswick, and then cut across the Appalachian Mountains and cycled over to Montreal, or tried to get to Montreal, got 10 miles over the Canadian border, and had a wonderful couple of weeks seeing spring through Vermont and Maine.
It's amazing you and I didn't cross paths, as I did the same thing. And my legs still hurt. Back to your project as I continue to wait for his file to come through. What did you do? Who was your last employer?
So I used to work through a framework called Ethos that was more focused on patient safety requirements in the UK. And a particular standard around health IT manufacturer safety that was set up by the guy who wrote the standard 20 odd years ago. Deviceology is
software engineer.
Do what?
Should we think of you as a software engineer?
No, I mean, I do have a bit of technical background, but I'm more of a risk assurance, medical device compliance kind of person. So quality management, cybersecurity, standards, device registration.
Do you have any insight about today's CrowdStrike event?
It's ironic when the thing that's meant to protect you against the outcome actually causes the outcome itself.
Right. Well, I don't know about that. I mean, the outcome is not, as I understand it, well, I don't understand it, but this isn't about a hack, is it?
No, it's a badly designed piece, a software update that they've released that causes a blue screen of death. That's knocking out the computers that lots of cloud services are hosted on and lots of software is running on. So they did publish a fix fairly quickly, which was to roll back the patch. But it's one of those never events that should never happen unless you're gonna host your services on 2 completely isolated technical stacks and be across AWS and Azure and have 2 different types of antivirus and split your infrastructure down the middle. Then there's always a risk that you're going to have an outage like this.
Okay. Darrin, I'm still waiting for the file to come through, so I must kindly and gently prod you to stop trying to do whatever you're doing with the computer, look at us, and start to talk to us, and I'll bring up your screen as soon as I get it.
You got it. Thank you, Joe, and sorry everyone for the slow start here. Again, wanted to talk today a little about medical device standards with a guide for the confused. As I was mentioning, the only guarantee I can really give is at the end, you'll still be confused. I think it's an inherently confusing topic that the more you understand, paradoxically, the more things that are confusing that do come up. So again, wanted to provide a quick little intro to myself since most of you are meeting me for the first time. Again, my name's Darrin Carlson. I've got over 10 years of experience now in medical device, combination product, and pharmaceutical quality assurance. Most recently with a big focus on quality management systems, especially measurement, analysis, and improvement activities such as CAPAs and audits, around which I recently started a side business with auditing and consulting. Germane to our conversation today, I've also spent the last couple of years as the leader of the External Standards Review Board at Bracco Medical Technologies. Before kind of diving into that, just a brief little personal note of why I'm doing what I'm doing today. So my freshman year of college, my mom was diagnosed with breast cancer, and after a couple of really difficult years of chemo and radiation, she fortunately entered remission. And again, this happened at a really pivotal time in my life when I was kind of figuring out what I wanted to do with college. It really informed me to, move into studying chemistry, starting out my career in pharmaceuticals, and really spurring me on to want to make an impact in the health and quality of life of other people. So after a brief detour then into alternative energy, I've come back now for the past several years into medical devices, combination products, where I hope to spend the rest of my career.
All right.
Yeah. So for standards, I've got typically sometimes when you're looking at standards, it can look like you're looking at a bowl of alphabet soup. So it's lots of letters, lots of numbers, and different versions of the standards, and it can be really difficult to kind of understand what you're looking at. So for example, an example I'm going to use today is 14971, which is the medical device risk management standard. And there's many different versions of it. So the most recent revision came out from ISO in 2019. There's different recognitions of that standard, different amendments that have also come on top of those. So again, it's just a very confusing thing, which I'll try to break down a little bit here. And hopefully by the end, you'll be able to interpret a little bit more what these standards are and kind of how to look at them and know what you're looking for in the first place.
Let's take a quick break. I'll ask Michelle to tell us why she's raising her hand. And Darrin, could you try to send that file again because it simply has not come through?
Sure. Otherwise, honestly, at this point, we'll just do it live, but everyone can just kind of look at my face. And like I said, my presentation is just more kind of supporting visuals rather than anything really critical to what I have to say here. So
Simple, let it go.
again, yeah.
But Michelle, you raised your hand.
Yep. So Darrin, one of my favorite things about the new QMSR quality management system regulation that is going to be in effect in February of 2026 is that it says in the preamble to it that we are not codifying 14971. But if you want to know what we mean when we say the word risk, you need to understand 14971.
That's just a sign of commitment, let me tell you.
Yeah, and I've got a little bit that kind of tease into coming up here. There's sort of like stealth, I don't know, like stealth regulations, or there's a voluntary-ish, I call it, nature to standards, which are it's just not so cut and dry, and it can be really frustrating and confusing to use the term of the day here to kind of understand how should we really be wrapping our brains around these things.
Michelle, I think you said they wrote, you need to understand 14971 to understand risk, but we're not gonna really use it.
They said they're not making it regulation because 1345 refers to 14971 fairly extensively. They said it's not regulation. Just because we adopted 1345 does not mean that we've also adopted 14971 as part of the regulation. But when 1345 says the word risk, you need to know what we mean is 14971.
Okay.
Right. It's not the ISO 9001
It's
definition of risk.
expectation, not regulation.
Mhm.
Do you,
That's a nice little tagline.
I want to tell you one thing, since I'm involved in standards, that a lot of people need to be involved in standards to help clarify the language. That's part of the problem with standards. It's a very small group of people trying to make things right for people to understand and easy to understand, but it's too small a group of people.
Mhm. And
That's
it
too
sounds as
many
though you
different
don't do any-
languages.
It sounds as though you don't do any kind of focus group or testing, or you're getting feedback like, does this make sense for you? How do you interpret what I just said, kind of
There's
stuff.
supposed to be experts doing it, but I can't find them for help with the 80 standards I do for ISO.
There's a
can't-
good, Jen,
Yeah.
how do you get involved into how do you get a part of a standards committee to get
And
involved?
do you get compensated for it?
No, I don't. That's the problem I'm having right now and trying
Which is why
to,
you're finding no one willing to have these long conversations of billable hours that are not billed.
right. But that's why you try and spread it out and hopefully work with different communities and groups that can do it. My problem with my standards is I've got 7 different industries involved and I can't find the organizations that actually speak for them. And it's very, very frustrating. And that's just one aspect of medical devices. I mean, we're writing a whole new standard right now, and I can only have 2 people from the US on it, mainly because they're the only ones that will show up for the meetings and run them.
I can't help but personalize with you a moment. God give you long life. Let's say you work this industry another 20 years. Who's going to be here in 2044 to help us with this stuff?
I don't know.
'Cause
I'm trying to force somebody to do it. I got it dropped on me because the guy that was doing it and got paid for it died. And his organization just left and he never trained anybody. And it's very frustrating with trying to develop standards. ASTM's got a little bit better reach, but it's only a little bit better. And it helps with the confusion actually to be on the standards because then you can justify them away when you need to.
Mark
And the
smiles in his
FDA is
moment.
involved with these standards, so you can find out what the heck they're trying to say. Excuse me, I'm on my high horse right
No,
now.
no,
It's
it's
just
fine.
sort
I'm
of,
intrigued by Mark's reaction because I know he comes from a legal background, and I'm sure the minutia of language gets in the way sometimes.
I mean, I totally agree, right? I mean, if you write the regulation, you know exactly how to get around it, and you write the regulation in order to be able to get around it. And so, yeah, I think Jan's absolutely right.
Darren, back to you.
All right, thank you. Starting it with a high picture of, why even concern ourselves with medical device standards in the first place. I would say just at a high level, it provides or can provide a strategic advantage in the form of faster regulatory approval. And then with some standards in some instances in some jurisdictions, they are actually required. As far as the challenges, in addition to everything that we've already kind of brought up here, there's no single organization that maintains everything. So there's many different standards development organizations to keep up with. They're typically separate from regulatory agencies, and the different jurisdictions themselves are going to be recognizing different versions, different amendments, different parts of these standards themselves. They get revised, they get replaced, and they are often obsoleted as well. Again, with the voluntary-ish nature of them, I would say, strictly speaking, more or less they're voluntary with a few exceptions. But regulatory agencies are accustomed to them. So, you have a decision. You can follow the well-worn path of using a standard or go your own way and try to meet those requirements on your own. The analogy that I have here is the Pan American Highway, which stretches 19,000 miles all the way from Alaska to the very tip of South America. And, you can drive your car that entire length except for a very small portion of 66 miles across the Darien Gap between Panama and Colombia. Now you can kind of go your own way and bushwhack through that area, and people do it, but this is full of wetlands and dense rainforest mountains. It's considered one of the most inhospitable regions in the world. Or you could take, again, the standard approach, which is, get your car on a ferry and go around that short area. It's, yes, expensive. It's going to require a lot of planning, more likely than not, but it's also more likely to get you in between continents faster and in one piece. The definition, the long-winded definition of what a standard is from IEC, bear with me a moment. It's a document established by consensus and approved by a recognized body that provides for common and repeated use, guidelines or characteristics for activities or their results aimed at the achievement of the optimum degree of order in a given context, which I would just summarize up as, standards offer the presumption of conformity to specific regulatory, safety, and performance requirements. Standards are also part of a, I'd say a hierarchy of documents of external origin, which medical device manufacturers need to monitor and control. If you imagine a pyramid, the top of that pyramid is going to be the laws, which are the output of the legislative branches of government. Under that are regulations, which are the implementations of the laws from the executive branch of government. Underneath that are guidance documents, which is a pretty big topic in and of itself. And under those would be standards, and even under that, something like technical reports. And within that broad band of standards, you could break things down even further into some different categories. First are basic or horizontal standards, which are very broadly applicable. Most, if not all, medical devices are going to fall under them. Things like ISO 13485 for QMS, 14971 for risk management, for example. On the bottom, the second category are the product or vertical standards, which are going to be really narrowly focused on a specific product, a specific type of testing. And in between those, more of a hybrid or group level of standards, which, like their name, apply to a group, not necessarily most medical devices. So, for example, ISO 14644 series still get tripped up on all the numbers for clean rooms, or IEC 62304 for medical device software lifecycle. Again, coming back to that kind of pyramid of hierarchy, those top three that I mentioned, the laws, regulations, and guidance documents, those are outputs of regulatory authorities themselves, but those bottom, the standards and technical reports, are going to be outputs of standard development organizations, or SDOs. So again, this kind of gets into the alphabet soup of things, but if you're looking at identifier, or you're looking at a standard, you're going to see an identifier, which typically includes something like ISO or IEC, ASTM, AMI. Those are going to be the SDOs who issue that standard. And these SDOs are entities that are just dedicated to creating and maintaining standards. So they give them a unique identifier. Again, 14971 for the example of risk management. ISO is the original issuer of that standard. So ISO 14971, give it a revision or addition level, which most recent is 2019. And then on top of that, it can be amended. There can be core addendums added on top of that. So once you start kind of spreading that out, you end up again with this kind of big bowl of alphabet soup of, for example, EN, ISO 14971, 2019, A11, 2021, I believe, which is a very specific version of the standard for a use in a very specific context. If that's not confusing enough, these SDOs will often issue versions of one another's standards. So, in addition to ISO 14971, you'll also have ANSI, AMI, ISO 14971, which again, just all gets very confusing very quickly. But this is the segue into the recognition process, where these SDOs will create these standards, but jurisdictions around the world will recognize them for presumption of conformity to different essential principles. The recognition process is going to vary from country to country, but some things to kind of keep an eye out for. Oftentimes, there's a periodic publication of lists and standards, which are updated and publicly available. There is often a transition period granted. So when a new revision of a standard is released, it doesn't necessarily mean that you need to comply with it immediately for any submissions that are upcoming. And then an interesting thing to note too is around what happens when a standard is updated, but there's product on the market with declarations of conformity to the previous standard. Typically, no action is required for those unless for these legacy devices, unless there are safety implications. So again, big asterisk with that, but I know that that's can be a big concern as well. Okay, the next confusing thing about standard is actually the words that we use. Oh, sorry, I think Rick, did you have a hand up?
I do. I've got a few questions, and an acceptable answer is I'm going to cover that later in the presentation. So the first question is, I'm a consultant. I do mechanical design, and one of my roles is to try to know when we're getting into a sticky area in the regulatory field. I'm not a regulatory professional, so what I try to do is just have the rough zoomed out Google roadmap of what we're doing, and if we're headed for a swamp or if we've got clean road ahead of us. And so here are the questions real quickly. From a consulting point of view, what input should I give my clients? And I know that's hugely general. If there is a point between hire a consultant now and fool around and find out, what is it and how to find it? Third question is there a hierarchy of general learning on these standards? In other words, we're going to get in and saturate, and we're going to get to a place where we're going, okay, I'm not going to become a professional in this, but now I have a good knowledge. So is there a hierarchy of general learning on these standards? And fourth, is there a good source of obtaining this learning hierarchy, if indeed it does exist? And so I know that's a lot of questions. I'll stick them in the text in a second, but that's what I was looking to know.
Sure. So if I can rephrase, and please correct me if I'm misinterpreting, you're curious about maybe a more logical, linear flow of understanding standards and which ones are important and which, how things kind of flow out of that, more generally speaking.
Going from general to focused. In other words, with a stainless steel, I know that when we get into high temperatures and exotic conditions, the choice of stainless steel becomes more critical. And so I know if we're looking at high temperatures or highly acidic or alkaline situations, and I know, well, okay, we've got, we need to look more closely. So knowing when to look more closely, knowing when to call on a professional and say, hey, we're already underwater, the periscope's about to go down, so I won't be able to see anymore. Give me some idea of what's going on. And so that's when, I've turned to metallurgists, people who are hyper developed in dynamic design, things like that. And I know in my field, the mechanical field, I know when to turn to these people. I know exactly when my skills need to be augmented by somebody who's bought the $50,000 software and gone through the training. And so in the area of regulatory, really affects design, because you can design yourself right into a box. You can paint yourself right into a corner if you're completely unaware of the regulatory limitations and when you're getting into trouble. And I try and make sure my customers avoid that at all costs. Well, at almost any cost. And so the hierarchy, how deep do we get in? What is our area of learning to at least let us know, oh my gosh, we need to call perhaps one of the people on this call.
Right. So that sounds like it's more the issues that you're noting are coming up more, very product specific, and maybe going from like bottom up and identifying which standards are applicable to a specific problem or product. Is that correct?
Or type of product, or type of construction, or type of manufacturing. Because
sure,
in the world where I work, manufacturing and design just do this. They get together. They interlace very, very closely. So I'm trying to keep I'm trying to protect my customers from getting into a situation of design risk where they're going to find themselves experiencing a design delay, or a production failure, or production underperformance, or difficulty in producing the product to where it becomes hyper expensive to produce a good quality product that will perform consistently. I'm trying to keep them out of those kind of things. I'm sort of their sheepdog to make sure that the design doesn't go astray. I'm sure everybody else, I'm sure Jan is doing the same thing with packaging, because I've heard her talk about this a lot. And I'm sure that is the function. I've heard Luke talk about it too. Just making sure that we keep our customers out of trouble. And regulatory trouble is as bad as any other trouble you could get.
Yeah, absolutely. And two things that come to mind then, as you say that, is maybe a top-down versus bottom-up approach. So in, again, for example, ISO 1345, and as Michelle mentioned, that standard references other standards as it goes throughout the process of describing the requirements of a quality management system. So, and again, for me as a QMS guy, that's my my bias in a sense that I tend to go back there when looking top down. Even if it's voluntary, even if under QMSR they won't be required the way that ISO 1345 will be, it can at least leave a trail of breadcrumbs that you can maybe chase down from top down, which other standards are out there which are going to be applicable to what you're looking for. The other one though is FDA's standards consensus standards database website is, I think, really fantastic. It has, I've got the number here, it's something like 1,548 entries when I last checked. So it's very comprehensive. It's frequently, if you look up a specific product code within FDA's databases, it will often reference different applicable standards specific to that device, or again, that group of devices. And often as well, other supporting documentations like those technical reports or even other FDA guidance documents. So I look at that as more, the bottom up approach. If the specific product and you're maybe trying to trace back the breadcrumbs to a higher level standard, where I would certainly myself start as well. But hopefully that was either helpful or provide some level of insight.
Can you drop the link to that consensus standards? Because that's one I'm pretty sure I don't have.
Certainly.
Rick, how could you miss that between consensus standards and I don't know, it's just one of those things I've always earmarked forever.
Well, it's just kind of, I'm ducking as the, as the inevitable criticisms come in, but I spend most of my time working on innovative solutions, but at the same time, I've got rear view mirrors and I use them. And looking at these kind of, looking at the nature of these regulations and the areas in which they begin to provide barriers and guardrails on the kinds of things that we do, that's just super important.
Totally understandable, Rick. The EU updated their list of consensus standards only about 4 weeks ago, so it's probably kind of got stuck in the airwaves somewhere, that link. But I was listening to your question and I was kind of trying to think how I'd answer it. And my immediate thought was, I'd actually probably turn it around and think it's probably easier to say, or easier to ask, well, are there any areas where there isn't a consensus standard? Or are there any areas where we don't need to be mindful of regulation? And if you're trying to protect or stay ahead of clients and make sure they've got a defensible position, which is really what is the essence of regulation, they need to, there's some global stuff like, make sure you have some quality around your medical device. Make sure you think about human factors engineering, cybersecurity, AI governance, and electrical safety. And there's kind of half a dozen generic standards that are pretty applicable in every other situation. But I'm struggling to think of a client I've worked with recently who's been able to say, well, do you know what? My defensible position is I've made this up and I don't have to think about standards. Or I don't have a reference point for the specific stuff that I'm doing. What normally trips me up is they come up with some really esoteric standard that's specific to their device that I've never heard about. And then we have to kind of do a dance to make sure that they've met all of the requirements.
Now they did there was an old experiment back when you could experiment on school children back in the good old days, where they had a schoolyard next to a highway, And most of you probably know about this experiment, but a bunch of kids playing and everything else, and they're running around, they're climbing up the fence and staring out at the cars going by. And then, and I hope this was a little bit regulated and controlled, but one night they came in and had some workmen remove the fence. So you've got the schoolyard, and then you've got this 6-lane highway on the other side, cars going by at huge speeds. And so what happened? Did the kids run out into the highway? No, they didn't. They all clustered around scared little groups close to the building. And that's how the experiment ended up. And so if you know about where the guardrails are, you're much more likely to be able to explore the totality of opportunities that you have, instead of and that's what I'm about. That's what my work is about, is exploring all of that stuff so that we can get the best solution. So if I know about where the guardrails are,
Except Rick, I found industry got rid of some guide rails, did very well for a few years, and then went beyond it and caused some other issues. So the FDA had to put the guide rails back. So
yeah, the guide rails actually allow us to use more of the playground, because you know where the cliff is, you know where the highway is.
yeah.
And so the kids actually, if the kids had a proper fence, they actually were much more free to play, because they knew they could use everything they could get at, they could use. And so that illustration, the guide rails are actually a huge benefit to innovation, because you've got a lot bigger area where you can do the things that you need to do for your client and design the solutions, and you know when you're going to start getting into trouble, so you just don't do that, but you can try everything else. And so
Yes,
I look
Rick,
at
but
the
in
map.
standard land, it's always, is this our fence or do we have another fence? Or how much can we go? How far can we go? There's always
There
a
you
lot of
go.
discussion on where are your limits? And it's between people who know the standards, it's between people who don't know the standards. So it's any way you look at it, it's always bad.
Yeah, and you're not going to be the subject expert on regulation. You know, you may decide, I think I'm calling Michelle right now, because you begin to realize you know about where the fence is, and you're going, I'm awfully darn close to this fence, and it is electrified, not like in the experiment with the kids. And you're just going, okay, yeah, and I've actually got a list of people from our group. And if I was going, I don't think our quality standards are really addressing this. I don't think, I think this is a blind spot for us. What am I going to do? I'm going to pick up the phone and call Nellie after consulting with my customer and saying, would you like some help on this? And then I'll get those two together. But even knowing where she needs to check up, that at least I know to talk to my client and say, our guidelines that we have in this company are not controlling this new thing that we're trying to do, and they're not applying to it. And we don't want to be stuck in the situation where someone can reasonably ask, why didn't you have procedures in place to at least know when this was going wrong in manufacturing? And I know that seems really simple, and you go, and anybody with any sense goes, well, gee whiz, no problem. Of course we would have that. But a lot of times we just don't think of it because we're going in the direction that we're going, and we're not really thinking in terms of what areas do we need to look at to make sure things stay on the straight and narrow.
Short term.
That's what makes this so fun.
The consensus standards website isn't working right now.
I think that's funny.
Yeah.
to me.
I have a picture of it if you want to let people see it.
Sure. Yeah, do you have a picture of just sort of the database entry or an example of one?
invite
No,
people
it's just, yeah.
Just invite people to copy the link and access it
Yeah.
later.
Yep, hopefully it works eventually.
Darrin, let me bring you back to where you were in your presentation.
Certainly. So kind of leaving things off again at the recognition process and how it differs from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. A quick kind of vocabulary lesson. You're going to see a lot of different words thrown around as far as the recognition status of standards. There's consensus, harmonized, designated, recognized, and for some reason, it seems that every country needs to come up with their own word to describe the recognized status of these standards. So if you hear consensus standards, that's the term that the US use. Harmonized is what the EU uses. I hope everyone can kind of appreciate the irony of the lack of standardization of these different words, but another confusing thing, which hopefully can unconfuse a little bit here. As we kind of got into a little bit here, I think FDA, when the database is working, it's really helpful with a lot of details. It includes information such as the extent of recognition of different standards. So FDA doesn't always recognize the entire standard. Sometimes they only recognize a portion of it. As well as the identical nature of standards. So ISO 14971, there's also the NCAMI ISO 14971, and FDA's website does note that they are identical standards. So it's less of a cat and mouse game trying to buy every version of the standard. Hopefully, if we have these types of things, noting that they are identical. Second, after the US, the EU does have their own, again, I think the link is in the chat here. I believe that's probably for the MDR consensus standards, which much smaller than the list out of the US. Currently, I believe I counted 26 under MDR, and before that 268 under MDD. It's not a database in the way that FDA's is, with a ton of supporting information for each standard. It's just one table that includes the standard, recognize what dates it's recognized, when it goes out of that recognition status, et cetera, et cetera. And the last thing I wanted to touch on that's confusing about standards in the EU is this the words or the term state of the art and how that relates to standards in the EU. So when you look at MDR, IVDR, this term or this phrase, different permutations of take into account the generally acknowledged state of the art tends to appear over and over and over again. And I've seen this most commonly interpreted as organizations are expected to comply with the most recent version of standards. That term state of the art is not defined in the regulations, though helpfully there are definitions in both the MDCG guidance documents on standardization, which was recently revised just a couple of weeks ago, I believe, and the EN ISO 14971, which again, the EN means that it's the European harmonized version. And that definition included there calls it the developed stage of technical capability at a given time. This is a much mushier concept than the latest and greatest, but further adding a note that this does not necessarily imply the most technologically advanced solution. On top of that, the verbiage take into account is noted in the guidance documents that does not mean comply with. Take into account and comply with are two separate things. So the common conception that take into account the generally acknowledged state of the art means comply with everything the moment it's released is actually not, again, supported by the guidance document or the harmonized standard. So I want to get that out there. That's a bit of it's been a confusing one for me, so I try to get on the soapbox and spread that gospel wherever I can. And so, again, just kind of wrapping things up, if I could share my screen here, I would show the big word salad of the EU harmonized version of ISO 14971, how that gets constructed. Again, 14971, that's the unique identifier of the standard. ISO is the SDO that releases that standard. EN ISO means it is the EU harmonized version. That 2019 is the revision edition. And furthermore, there is an amendment released in 2021, which includes a helpful Z annex that correlates the requirements in the MDR and IVDR regulations with the requirements listed in the standard. So quickly, just wrapping things up here, again, standards are confusing. They're confusing if you don't understand them. They're confusing if you do understand them. They're decentralized. There's a different recognition process in each country, and there's this voluntary-ish nature to them. However, I think if you there's ways to decode that nomenclature to understand where they are applicable and to what extent they're applicable by understanding the recognition process, and in particular having access, again, when the website works for FDA, EU, Canada, and UK as well have lists of standards, that there's a way to make at least more sense of this. So you may still be confused, but I hope we are all in this together now at this point.
What I
They do
take away
say-
is don't attempt to do this on your own and consult a
Yeah.
professional.
Well, they do say in the foreword for whatever country recognizes the stuff on whether it's the same as the original or not, and what parts they have adopted or not, so that it helps to read the foreword.
Yes, I'm a big fan of how FDA has set up the standards database. There's a lot of really helpful information in each of those entries.
I have a question for you, or maybe for everyone. First, you have the law, and then you have the regulations, and the regulations only say that there are harmonized or recognized standards, and then you show compliance. If you want to do otherwise, you can always do that. Even in standards themselves, like in the 60601, I think it's clause 4.2, it says if you know a way of otherwise demonstrating safety, go ahead, demonstrate it. The only problem is that if you want to demonstrate it, you have to go to, well, in Europe, you go to a notified body. And the notified body is full of regulatory people, not of technical people. So what they do is they go to, usually you have a test house and a notified body, and they're legally separate entities. They're only on the other side of the street. So if the notified body has a technical question, they go to the other side of the street to their, like with data, they can notified body on this side, they got a test house on the other side. They say, if there's a question, they go to the test house and they ask the people of the test house on a question on the technical matter. But they're only educated into the standards. They're not. So they only say the answer they can give you. The standards say this. Yeah, but now we have someone who thinks he has a loophole or a escape route or something, and it's different. We cannot say anything about it. It's not in the standards. So, have anybody of you ever had a client or somebody else who found a way around what it was said in the standards?
But that was like back in the old days, it was much easier to write rationales around why whatever clause didn't apply.
I mean, the days that we were still young and handsome.
Exactly.
When I
But
had
like I
color in
had
my
a
hair.
client that I'm sorry, Jen, go ahead.
Oh, I just say when I had color in my hair. But yes, I have done that and recently, and we do that by proving our test methods are statistically sound and validated. It's really a pain in the behind to do, but with the statistics and doing the test methods properly, so you validate the test method, you validate what you're testing, all statistically sound,
And yet,
you can
Jan,
get
they
around
didn't ask,
what it is.
sorry to interrupt you, but they didn't ask you, do you have a setup with good laboratory practices?
Oh
Where
yeah,
are
you've got
your-
to make sure they've got their 17, whatever it is, qualified for whatever your test is. If they don't have it as a standard test method, they've got to develop it themselves and prove statistically that it's sound. And there's a standard for that.
So
And
usually it's a lot of more work than just
it's
comply to
about
the
3
standard.
times more work than just following the standard.
I'd like to interject an administrative note, recognizing that just about half of the people on camera right now are calling in from Europe. Next week, our speaker is Dr. Stephen Gilbert, calling us from Germany. He is the professor of medical device regulatory science at the Technical University of Dresden, and he's going to attempt to talk about simplifying MDR. So that may be a topic of interest for a lot of folks next week. Darrin, I appreciate you taking us through your presentation despite our technical difficulties, but I think that we got the gist. And if you'd like to attempt to share the presentation again, if you think it'd be valuable for me to distribute, I can do that. So thank you, everybody.
Yeah. Thank you.
And I hope to see you next week for basically a continuation of our conversation about regulatory standards. Thanks so much. See you then. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.